going to continue on the introduction series that I previously started, and the introduction series to Black participation in World War II and understanding its context. Now, in the previous video, I talked about the significance of the Civil War and how it connects to Black involvement in World War II, as well as the aftermath of the Civil War, including the formation of the Buffalo Soldier Regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and 28th, 24th, and 25th Infantry, as well as the changing sentiments, the establishing of the viewpoint of the significance of Black military service and connecting it to the fruits of citizenship. Now, with that being said, I'm going to continue on that with this video, primarily talking about Black involvement in World War II, and mostly not really the military involvement, but more so the views on Black service in World War II, not World War II, but World War I actually, and then from that point building up to the eve of World War II. Now, with that being stated, to get properly started, I will try to start off with a quote from one of the more prolific black intellectuals during this period. This is the country to which we soldiers of democracy return. This is the fatherland for which we fought. But it is our fatherland. It was right for us to fight. The faults of our country are faults. Under similar circumstances, we would fight again. But by the God in heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. Now, this was a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, and this is actually, he actually said this at the end of World War I. But it's pertinent to start this off because to understand Black involvement in World War I is to understand the notion of what's considered the new Negro, the ideology of the new Negro, or the new black person in America. So, with all that being stated, during the build-up to U.S. involvement in World War I, Black figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged Blacks to join the military, often echoing similar sentiments that Frederick Douglass have echoed at that time, at that time during the Civil War. Now, of the Blacks who were vocally supportive of Black participation in World War I, Du Bois was actually one of the louder voices. And he actually went as far as to publish a work called Close Ranks in the Crisis magazine, which again encouraged Blacks to join the fighting abroad to help preserve American ideals. Now, when you look at that, you will think, well, preserve American ideals, this is the early 1900s, and as Black Americans, shoot, we barely have any rights. I mean, think about it. To put it in perspective, only a few years before, not Plessy v. Ferguson, but the case that led to the justification of separate but equal, or Jim Crow laws, passed. So to view the ideology of fighting on behalf of American ideals kind of sounds backwards, but again, as I mentioned before, during this period, you kind of have the evolving of what's called the new Negro, or which I will let somebody else delve upon that, or you can research it yourself if you wish to. Now, of course, that being said, as I said before, the irony of what he said wasn't really lost on a lot of people, on some people at the time, and some people would look at that and say, well, you're talking about fighting on behalf of this country, but we're still fighting to become full citizens. But I digress. Now, ultimately speaking, when it does come to Black involvement in World War I, over 3,500,000 Blacks did serve in the U.S. Army during World War I, and the majority of those numbers served primarily overseas. Now, when it comes to Black involvement in World War I, especially overseas involvement, the vast majority of Black soldiers who did see service in World War I served in units such as basically rear echelon units like Service, Supply, Steve Doors, who worked on offloading cargo. But there was a small percentage that did see combat. Some were sent over, excuse me, with the Pioneer Infantry Regiments, Pioneer Infantry Battalions, which were basically the same thing as combat engineers. But in addition, the U.S. Army created, technically, the U.S. Army created one all-black combat division, which was the 92nd Division, and they also created another black division, though it wasn't fully complete, and that was the 93rd Division, which was the 93rd Provisional Division. In addition to those units, you also had black serving in infantry regiments. Now, of course, the more famous of the Black World War One infantry regiments was the 369th Infantry Regiment, otherwise known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Now, of course, while they are the more well-known, you also had other black regiments, infantry regiments that fought in World War One. And in fact, again, because I'm a South Carolinian, I'm obligated to bring this up. One of the units that also deployed alongside the 369th Infantry was a unit called the 371st Infantry Regiment. And what made the 371st unique was that, unlike the 369th Infantry or its sister regiments like the 369th Infantry, the 370th, and the 372nd, which were comprised primarily of black National Guard units that were from New York and the Midwest, the 371st was comprised primarily of draftees or soldiers that were basically drafted into military service, and the vast majority came from South Carolina and North Carolina, and you had a few from other states. Now, another reason why this is significant too is because the first Medal of Honor recipient from the first black Medal of Honor recipient from World War One came from the 371st Infantry Regiment, and his name was Corporal Freddie Stowers, and he was again from South Carolina. Now, of course, people know about Sergeant Johnson because, of course, Obama went back and reviewed his record and gave him the Medal of Honor. But before him, there was Corporal Freddie Stowers out of South Carolina. So, had to bring that up. But in addition, now with blacks going overseas and serving in World War One, somebody may ask, well, did the U.S. Army send? What about the Buffalo Soldier regiments? I mean, you have the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Were they deployed overseas? And actually, no, they were not. And it's kind of ironic because you would expect that, well, this is a combat situation, you will send the most veteran soldiers over there. And for some reason, the U.S. Army kept them closer to home. They kept the 9th and 10th Cavalry on the border because they basically was on the border, basically kind of keeping tabs on Mexico, basically, because that's during the Mexican Civil War. Then you had the 24th and 25th, which went between border service and serving stateside, as well as the 25th being in Hawaii at the time. But now, when it came to stateside service, World War One brought about a lot of changes for the black community, and one of the changes led was basically the Great Migration. Now, another thing that occurred during this time period too, again, harkening back to what I mentioned before about the New Negro, because you had black soldiers who were seeing military service, and not only seeing military service, but were proud of their service, this often led to clashes between black soldiers, and not only black soldiers, but the black population and the white population during this time, who had animosity towards black populations either moving into their town or suddenly getting jobs, or having a large presence of black soldiers in their area. And of course, during World War One, and really during the aftermath of World War One, you had numerous racial what they call riots, but really racial massacres, racial-based massacres. But you also had a riot. So, in the case of World War One, the one that really stands out during that time period is the Houston riot of 1917. Now, I can devolve into that, but I don't want to take up the entire time really talking about explaining the subject. But I would advise that if you do get the time to actually read up on the Houston riot, and if you wish to see a movie on the Houston riot, well, a movie that's loosely based on the Houston riot. I'm obliged to say that because I know my mentor will probably be ticked if I said that. But if you want to see a movie that's loosely based on the Houston riot, that actually somewhat follows the material somewhat well, I would suggest watching a movie called The 24th. It came out this year, and from my research on the Houston riots, while it's a fictionalized account of the Houston riots, some of the core events still follow the what led up to the actual event taking place. So, but to get back on topic, yes, with World War One, you saw like increased racial tension. You had events such as the Houston riot of 1917, and then of course, as these black veterans started demobilizing and returning home, you start seeing a slew of other race riots and race massacres that started occurring throughout the country in a period that will become known as Red Summer. Now, in addition to the race riots and the racial massacres that occurred in 1919, you also had a period also after during that same time where you had black veterans who were returning home from World War One that would get lynched or just horribly murdered. And to bring about a quick example of that, there's an example of a Mr. Wilbur Little out of Blakely, Georgia, who was simply killed for refusing to take off his military uniform. Now, the way the story goes, like, is supposedly this was after he demobilized. He came back home. The white population, the people that was in the area, wanted him to take off his uniform. He refused, and they sent a mob and they beat him bloody. There's another example of a Herman Arthur from Paris, Texas, who was also a World War One veteran who was accused of basically insulting a white woman. And long story short, him and his brother were bound up, and burned alive. So, like, these are just some of the incidents that occurred. You had a lot of these incidents occurring in the aftermath of World War One, and part of it was, in essence, done to, depending on who you talk to, and depending on who you talk to at that period, it was done to, in essence, remind black folks of their place in American society. Because, of course, when black soldiers went, not only when black soldiers and the black people at the time were able to get jobs or move north and, in essence, gain access to trying to become a little bit more economically stable, as well as when the black soldiers went overseas and were treated at least more fairly by their counterparts in the French army and other military units, it led to soldiers coming home and wanting to advocate for that change so that they too in America could be treated like full citizens. Again, harkening back to why I said the quote at the very beginning. Now so after World War One ended, the U.S. Army War College launched a study to try to investigate, okay, well, how did black soldiers perform in World War One? And more importantly, how will black soldiers be employed in future conflicts? So ultimately, the U.S. Army War College did a study, and they ended up publishing their findings in 1925. And fortunately, I have a copy of the study right here. Now, before I get into reading some of the quotes, again, keep in mind this War College study was published in 1925. So we must understand that during the time period, you still had an element of, like, you got an element of social Darwinism. You had social Darwinism taking place. You also had almost the study of eugenics. Not really eugenics, I'm probably mispronouncing the thing, but you had where people actually studied people and tried to figure out, okay, well, based off these certain features or based off this genetics, this will produce either smarter people or these will be subservient people. So I'm just going to try to read a few quotes from the Army War College study to kind of paint a picture of the mindset that permeated through this study. And again, I'm going to explain how it's impacted World War II. So with the overview on the second portion, they say, quote, "The Negro does not perform his share of civil duties in times of peace in proportion to his population. He has no leaders in industrial or commercial life. He takes no part in government. Compared to the white man, he is admittedly of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character." Now, in terms of military service, the mobilization plan provides for approximately 140,000 Negroes for non-combat duty. This will leave approximately 30,000 for the experiment of combat duty. Notice that they said the experiment of combat duty. And of course, and this kind of ties into historical context as well, the majority of Negroes left at home will be in the southern states where they will be needed for labor and where they can best be handled by competent whites. Interesting. Now, I'm going to try to cut it right there because, and in fact, I would actually advise that if you get the time to actually look this up and read it, because now to give it some credit, not that much credit, but still some credit nonetheless, when it does talk about black military service, they do admit that, well, when it comes to like rewarding excellent service, they must be rewarded, black soldiers must be rewarded in proportion, the same way and held to the same standards as white soldiers. But as you continue reading through it, it's a very scathing report that speaks on, that says that black military officers failed in World War One, that black soldiers were overall incompetent, and that in order for them to reach their full competency level, they had to be commanded by whites. Now, there is one passage where they do mention a little bit later how that you can introduce black officers, but if you do have black officers, they cannot command any white soldiers, even though they may outrank them. If they are, say for example, if you're a black lieutenant, you can't be in charge of a white sergeant, even though you outrank them. But yeah, I would suggest that if you get the time, take the time to read the Army War College study, and you will understand, and take the time to read it, but also understand the historical context that produced this, and to understand, more importantly, how this connects to World War II. Because oftentimes when you hear people talk about World War II and they say like Tuskegee Airmen or 71st Tank Battalion, they will tell you that, well, us serving in these roles was an experiment. And a lot of that terminology comes directly back to the study. The fact that, again, you see a lot of black soldiers getting employed in service and supplies during World War II, again, ties back to this. And ultimately, the view that people take on black soldiers, especially when they perceive that black soldiers failed to perform in combat properly, again, ties back to this document right here. But to move on, now, as the interwar period continued and it started building up to the eve of World War II, FDR went again with the urging of his wife Eleanor, which also, when you look at World War II stuff, World War II things involving black soldiers, she does play an integral role in that. She urged FDR to create what becomes known as the Black Cabinet, which the Black Cabinet is an unofficial group of black policy advisors that urge the president to form policies that help at least black Americans benefit from some of the New Deal policies. And the idea behind it is that, at the very least, by allowing black folks to participate in New Deal policies, it wasn't like let all black folks. It was letting black folks participate in proportion to the population. So if you had, like, say for example, when it came to welfare funds, there was supposed to be 10% allocated to the black community, because again, at the time, the black population was considered about 10 to 12% of the U.S. population. Now, the last thing I'm gonna touch on for tonight is the March on Washington and how that influences the black participation in World War II later. Now, during the build to World War II, folks like A. Philip Randolph and Barry Rustin and other black advocates and black leadership was starting to apply pressure to the federal government to, one, include blacks into the defense jobs involving the defense industry and federal agencies, because again, usually during times of war, particularly in the case of World War I, that's where you start seeing blacks actually starting to gain some elements of economic uplift. Now, it's not complete economic uplift, but it's it's an increased chance of access to economic uplift. So during the 1930s and really up to the early 1940, 41, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and other folks start lobbying and applying pressure to the government to, one, let blacks into defense industry jobs and federal agencies with and have fair access to them, and then B, desegregate the U.S. Armed Forces under the premise that given that we will probably be fighting the forces of fascism and that we're fighting a force that in essence was openly racist, we should exude the American ideal that we're unified by having a unified military force to show that. And in fact, to accomplish this, they threatened to do a series of marches on Washington, with the first one taking place in 1941. Now, of course, there was build up and anticipation to it, but of course, again, this was the eve of World War One. So, to counteract the march on Washington, FDR met with some of the leadership and met with the black cabinet, and ultimately they in essence did a compromise, and the compromise was Executive Order 8802. Now, the way the executive order worked, it was supposed to ban discrimination based on race. Now, if you read it says race, religion, creed, but in the case of the historical context, it was the base to ban discrimination based on race in terms of hiring for defense jobs and other federal agencies. So in essence, making it making it open for black folks who wish to work in defense industries such as shipbuilding, like automotive plants, like stuff that would be used for the war effort. The idea was to make it fair and accessible to all people, but in this case, particularly blacks, to work in those industries. Now, as for desegregating the armed forces, FDR supposedly agreed with it, but he did not push for any policy to do that. In fact, the order to integrate the U.S. Army wouldn't take place until after World War II, and really wouldn't take place until really after the Korean War. But in the case of this, why is it significant to World War II? While he doesn't integrate the U.S. Army, he does make it to where the U.S. Army has to have the U.S. Army, specifically the individual branches of the U.S. military, like the U.S. Army and the individual branch within the Army and other elements, had to accept a certain amount of black soldiers or black recruits in proportion to the general population. So that meant, like in the case of, like say for example, in the Army, if you had black field artillery, if you had a field artillery, you had the field artillery branch. Within the field artillery, you have to have X amount of black units within the field artillery. Same thing with infantry. If you have X amount of infantry, you must have X amount of black infantry. Same thing with, and in fact, like tank destroyers and armored warfare. And in fact, and this is the last thing I'll bring up in regards to this, during this time period, you had the U.S. Army doing like maneuvers. Basically, both the Army and the Navy was doing maneuvers to try to do like exercise to figure out how to grasp new mechanized things, machines of warfare, how to best exploit them. And one of the things that came out of the exercises was the tank destroyer branch, which I'll cover a little bit later in the series. And General McNair, who I think at the time, I think he was a three-star general, he advocated for the creation of the tank destroyer branch, and also ended up advocating for the creation of black units within the tank destroyer branches. Now, as for how that played out, how well that played out, I'll cover a little bit later when we get closer to discussing the tank destroyer branches. But with that being stated, when it comes to this period up to the lead up of World War II, you kind of end up seeing, whereas during the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, you see that the core ideology of military service that carried over was mostly the ideas of citizenship. But unlike the Civil War, where you saw like individuals or small groups of black veterans coming back and like joining with other elements of the black community to advocate for the overall betterment of the black community, you start seeing like one of the trends that carried over from World War I and really carried over into really World War II, that the veterans, particularly of World War I, because of their experiences abroad, they came back ready to fight. Sometimes non-violently, and in some cases in defensive actions, to show that to basically to not only fight abroad for their citizenship, but fight to assert that assert their American citizenship here too. So as a result, it's interesting because with the case of World War I, now of course with the Civil War I mentioned before how the Civil War established the ideology of black military service with citizenship as well as segregating the military to in essence fit with the notion of separate but equal. You really see that solidifying in the aftermath of World War I, and really by the time this war college study is published in 1925, it's pretty much set in stone. So by the time World War II starts, a lot of the stuff that was in flex, such as, for example, the employment of black officers, the number of black units and like their roles, it gets solidified by 1925. So by the time we get to 1942, really the first year of U.S. involvement in World War II, you will see cases such as where the U.S. Army may accept black soldiers, but they're only accepting them on a quota-based system, saying, well, we got enough in this unit to accept people, we can accept them here. The Navy will accept black sailors, but they will only accept them as initially as mess attendants, which were cooks, or stewards, which will be the equivalent of butlers to officers on the vessel. Now, of course, later they start opening them for all ratings, meaning that if you were educated and tested well enough, you could apply to be any rating you wished. But nevertheless, a lot of the blacks in the Navy during that time still ended up in mess attendant stewards, or in the case of a subject I want to talk about a little bit, well, probably later in the series, ammunition handling, stevedores, longshoremen, stuff like that. The Army Air Forces at the time was starting to accept blacks, but they really didn't. They was kind of mandated to accept blacks, and that was primarily through pressure. Because in addition to people like A. Philip Randolph, Barrett Rushton, you also had black newspapers like the Chicago Defender, and more importantly, the Pittsburgh Courier, that applied pressure to the U.S. military to accept blacks in all ranks. And of course, the Marine Corps during this period, which I'm gonna use as a starting point for the next video with the unit that I'm gonna be covering, the Marine Corps at the time was not accepting blacks. It wasn't until a little bit later where they ended up accepting blacks into their ranks. But with all that being said, I hope that I was able to pique y'all interest in this subject and provide some context to what's occurring and what's kind of happening behind the scenes during the build up to World War II. And I wish to thank y'all, and I hope y'all have a good evening.